kind of separating the tools from the bundling again, and making MicroProfile the bundling umbrella for kind of smallish servers, like web profile, but just smaller, and moving the technologies like configuration, JWT, JOT, and stuff like that on the same level like servlets and JuxRS.
And, and we've talked about that too in the past, that with some of the stuff with MicroProfile, is it these components are kind of taking on a life of their own, should they have their own component? So just for everyone on the call here, I just noticed I didn't start the recording. So I just did it midstream on Mark's discussion there. So this is just, what's the date today? February 20th. The MicroProfile Open Hangout. Just do a quick introduction. We were just talking about, I don't know what you want to say, the relationship, future of the JCP in accordance with the E4J movement and for MicroProfile, and just kind of discussing the future there.
Yeah, well, one of the questions that was brought up, you may want to recap, is, what's the status of the config specification that was,
on the MicroProfile config or the JSR?
No, the JSR.
The JSR. Oh, well, it's basically we took the work we did, basically almost the same people, and moved this over to the JCP. Just renamed the package from IO MicroProfile, then later org Eclipse MicroProfile, and then to JavaX config. But the initial content was exactly the same like MicroProfile, and Emily already took a few changes we did, like the implicit converters we spec'd for the config JSR, and took this back to MicroProfile. So they are kind of evolving in parallel, just with different package names. But we recently added some bigger features like push configuration. So you could kind of register yourself as from the user land, from the application side, to get notified when certain configuration values change. So we figured out a very easy and lightweight way to have a push API to push configuration into the application. And
Mark,
yeah.
So are you proposing that back through the MicroProfile config at the same time?
Yes, it's not yet there because we're still having discussions. But once we settle the discussions in config JSR, I would suggest to move them also back to MicroProfile.
But then, isn't that kind of like
weird
backwards?
No, because some features it's done in parallel, and actually I would love to have them unified, both specs, because it's basically the same people doing the same stuff, and just a few features start in MicroProfile config, and a few other features start in the config JSR project. It's just kind of what project do you have open, and well, and that's it. And once a single feature is done, it gets kind of pushed to the other side, or applied to the other side. And that's of course that's kind of duplicating the work.
Yeah.
But we still have no final clue where the config JSR is heading to. Technically, it looks really good, but Andre, you're humming.
And not in a good way.
But it's course it's overhead. It's not that big, but it's overhead still. And with moving to E4J, if we would move the config JSR to E4J finally, we could kind of unify it with MicroProfile officially again, because then it's under the same umbrella again.
Yeah.
So Mark, this new push feature that you guys are discussing in the JSR, has that topic been brought up in the config, MicroProfile config?
Yeah, okay. The dynamic configuration is the topic, and dynamic configuration contains of two parts. This is the first part is kind of the pull API, and this is the config value which I proposed to MicroProfile config. I think it was even in my original proposal back in June 2016. And people are re-evaluating this now again and start to kind of get it, and I had quite a few positive feedback about this. And the push API is a bit newer, but we've been discussing this also in MicroProfile already in kind of the early days. The only thing is back then we had no idea how to do it in a very lightweight way, because the other solutions out there on the market, there are a few config solutions which have some push functionality, but it's 15 interfaces and it's totally overcomplicated. And we made it down with a new approach, mostly done by Thomas Langer and me, and this now has two methods. One method on the config interface, and one method, which is a default method, on the config source interface. So you don't even need to implement it if you don't want to kind of, okay, I wonder how much I should go into the detail, but it would be too much for this session. I can just give you the link and...
I was just curious. So, I mean, if you proposed this back in 2016, this must have been discussed then during the MicroProfile config talks before config 1.0 went out. Then.
Yeah, definitely. Yes.
Oh, okay. And it was decided by that working group that it would not go into config 1.0 or 1.1 or...
yes, it's... we started with we started at the bare minimum. This was kind of back then. It was. It's easier to add something later, but it's really hard to get rid of something which you kind of rolled out some.
And it kind of talks to the difference in nature of the two projects, right? I'm thinking let's just call it Jakarta for discussion purposes, and MicroProfile. In my mind, MicroProfile is, agility, we're putting out changes faster. And I think there is no, from what I understand, there is no guarantee for backward compatibility also, right?
Yes, because that was the discussion I was having with Kevin back then. And that was the reason why I agreed to use the Org Eclipse MicroProfile package because it's not a standard and we could later remove things. So we could happily just add this to MicroProfile config. But it's no problem. We can I can ship this till tomorrow, and we can give this to people and they should play with it. And then if it works out for them, we move this back to the config JSR.
Yeah, I think that kind of makes sense, because I think that's kind of the original intent of MicroProfile.
Yes. The point is we kind of reversed this, but you're totally right from what we defined. My gut feeling was that since the config JSR is not yet productional, it's easier to play with things without breaking people's application.
Well, yes.
And that was the reason why we kind of did this. But actually, from what we defined, from the workflow and agility perspective, it would be better to first try this in MicroProfile.
And in future, I think it would be fine if a spec from MicroProfile is sent to Jakarta for as a candidate JSR or whatever we want to call the new terminology. And because of the nature of the projects, that some changes may be made to the JSR for MicroProfile before it's actually standardized.
For J, we would need something like we discussed this, like a sandbox specification. So a specification before it is kind of final and agreed could have a kind of a sandbox package. So we could have a Jakarta specifications, and we could have Jakarta sandbox specifications or MicroProfile sandbox specifications. If the requirement for much more stability exists, which was not the case, explicitly not the case for MicroProfile.
Correct. And I think that's still part of it that we need, that will need to be defined for EE4J going forward. Is where do we still do that experimentation? And is that what we use MicroProfile for? I think that's what we got to figure out.
Yeah, or another sandbox mechanism.
Yep.
So we kind of have something which looks good, which doesn't break the backward compatibility to the established kind of acknowledged specifications, the official versions, but new features of a sandbox version could get removed again.
That's kind of along the lines of the discussion that's happening with the messaging stuff, you know, and Andro, I know that you've been involved with that, and, you know, just trying to get that group, I don't know, kind of like understand what the intent of MicroProfile was, you know, and to be able to do the experimentation before it becomes a standard.
But there is always a trade-off between being totally experimental. In that case, you can come up with a cool API, but nobody will use it.
Yeah.
Because if you're too much floating around, then the people cannot use it in their applications. So we need at least a little bit of stability and foreseeability.
I think at least for the config 1.0, when we begin the first specification in MicroProfile, the intention was to keep or to think stable, but not avoid breaking changes. At least I had that idea. Try to create a stable API, but if something really goes wrong, we shouldn't hesitate to get rid of it.
Yes.
And if we keep it this way, it's still usable for production, and also, like, I see that implementations ready for production usage provide this API. If it wasn't stable enough, nobody would use it because they couldn't rely that it will be there in the next version.
It basically boils down to removing methods or signatures, changing signatures, and this looks. In the first perspective, it doesn't seem to be a problem if you say, oh, we deprecate this method and then 2 versions later we remove it. In practice, like for example with Google, what's that Commons clone, Guava, they removed some methods. In the beginning, in the early days, they just skipped the methods and removed them. Now they deprecate them and remove them 2 versions later. In practice, it's still a problem that you have libraries which use an old Guava version, and you need another library which has a new Guava version. And then even if they gave kind of 3 versions time to fix the packages, this doesn't happen because you have an old library and you can't change it anymore. So backward compatibility is really a key feature, a key benefit of the existing Java EE APIs.
Yeah, but this basically explains the purpose of MicroProfile. Like, MicroProfile should be quite stable to use to allow people to really use these things in production, even if they want to. But still innovate and allow breaking changes, and that is the purpose of it along Java EE and EE4J, which should be stable and without breaking changes. So, like in the future, as come back to what you were talking about, I think it still makes sense to have these 2 like in parallel for these 2 different purposes. Maybe MicroProfile will become a subset of Java EE in the future. Maybe there will be only a like intersection of them. MicroProfile will still have some innovative things that won't even come to Java EE.
Yeah, This question will come to a head sometime this year, I'm sure.
So far, my view is that E4J hasn't been yet established fully to be capable of producing new work. So MicroProfile is the only thing we have right now.
Right.
The showstopper for E4J is whether the TCK gets finally handed over or not.
Oh,
because without the TCK,
there's many things to do. Like when I was listening to Mike Milinkovic, he said that they want to first create a Java EE compatible implementation by July. They want to establish processes to go on with new specifications or even existing specifications, and Oracle needs to also open source TCKs, which will take a couple of months, if not a year or more.
Well, so, this is the whole problem with, this was the showstopper with kind of brought the JCPA to an end. That the TCKs are not freely available. This was the core question why all the JCPA blew up. One of the core problems. The other core problem is that, there's two core problems. That it's kind of companies who kind of had some much more saying than all the rest. This was one of the core problems. And the second problem was that the GCP, due to the backdraft license to the TCKs, so you only get the IP and the patent grants for the specs if you pass the TCK, but you can't get the TCK. So this kind of links the deadlock in itself. And this was the second problem which blew up the GCP.
Yep. So Mark, I think what you said earlier, when we start seeing the TCKs and the CTS, when they start getting dropped into Eclipse, I think that's going to be a key goal, a key milestone to show that this is real.
This will be the defining moment.
Yep. And I know they're struggling with it. To be fair, the whole TCK and CTS has been so, behind closed doors for so long, and they've got all of this code that they're struggling with trying to figure out how to clean it up enough in order to provide it. So it's a tough problem. I will give them that, and so it'll be good to see when the code or the TCKs actually start to drop.
Another thing that comes to my mind is that it's still not clear what happens with the specification documents. I had the impression that Oracle won't donate it to Eclipse, and we would need to write new specification documents. Only Java docs will be donated. So that will be a lot of work, even if we get TCKs from Oracle.
Totally agree, Andrew. I don't.
These are all the risks. I'm just saying it loudly. It's not basically a question. It's just for the records. These are all, and that's still what makes or why MicroProfile makes sense. Because, as I said, it's the only thing right now what we have. We can continue to evolve, and we still need to wait for many things just to catch up with what Java EE already contains.
Yep.
Yeah. So the TCK move, so it's just a matter of time, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes. No, I have not seen any inkling that there's any, hesitation or deliberate hesitation. It's just a matter of crossing all the T's, dotting all the I's, and making sure all the licensing is good, and they've got the originality figured out, and it's just a lot of work.
The funny thing about TCKs is that even to continue working on new specifications or versions, it may not be required to have the open source TCKs, because Eclipse should be able to run the TCK even though it's closed source. And if we develop new versions of reference implementations, we could theoretically run them against TCK, even though it's not open source, and add additional tests on top of it.
Yeah.
So it's not complete showstopper, but it will be really ridiculous to continue this way for a long time.
What about the? This is a very fundamental question, and it's also a little bit philosophical. The reference implementations. It seems all the people focus on the reference implementations. Why that? For me, the reference implementations, most of the times they have been early, but the quality was not so that you can use it one-to-one in production. I mean, Andre, you kind of, you know this, you must have put, or Payara must have put many years into making this production ready. I was not quite so satisfied with the quality of the reference implementations. And what I figured is that, like with specs or like CDI, where you had multiple implementations, the specification was much better at the end. The TCK was much better at the end than kind of a few other specifications which only had one implementation. You know what I'm talking about? And the question is whether, like we in MicroProfile, we don't say we have one reference implementation, but we try to make the specs, to make the API, the TCK so good that basically every implementation behaves the same.
I don't know, but just my 50 cents to this. I think that reference implementation, there can be two different reference implementations. One of them could be meant from the start, can be meant to be production ready, such as Weld for CDI. And others can be just toys, just to demonstrate that something is working. And that's partially, I don't want to say anything bad about the JSON, but it's just a thing that was created as a reference implementation for JSON-B, and is not very well tested. So you have two different approaches to reference implementation. And in MicroProfile, we basically said that we don't care. And from what I saw, most of the implementations are just toys. The initial implementations are just toys, and then they are turned into real projects afterwards. But I don't know. I think it's even better to have a really small, simple reference implementation, and then create implementations afterwards. But that's what was chosen by Oracle. They had Glassfish as a reference implementations. They even supported it in production, and then they dropped the support, so it really became just a toy product.
So
I don't know what's better.
Just for my background, like for Payara, how much have you had to modify Glassfish in order to support it? Has that been a lot of work?
Like, we try to keep it compatible so that we can merge two ways, from Payara to Glassfish and also from Glassfish to Payara. So we tried not to rework what's already there. So mostly we fixed bugs in Glassfish source code and added our own source code on top of it or next to it. And we fixed, I think, I don't think we even counted now, but it's around 150 bugs in Glassfish that are fixed in Payara. Not even like half of them is fixed in Glassfish. So Glassfish still contains a lot of bugs. But most of these bugs weren't really huge. It was just a couple of lines of code here and there.
Back to Yasun and JSON-B, I've contributed to JSON-B and JSON-P specs. And this is one area where I think that an open TCK development model like with CDI would have been really, really beneficial. In CDI, I alone reported about not quite sure, 50 to 100 TZK bugs, and we improved this together. And so the TZK itself also became much more stable. And we got a tons of spec clarifications out of it and so on. So having open TZKs and having the different vendors contribute to the TZKs is really, really beneficial for the spec, for the TZKs, and for the overall stability and portability.
Is Glassfish going to be the reference implementation for Jakarta?
That's probably an open question. The first thing is all of Glassfish is being contributed, and then that needs to be verified that it executes against the Java EE8 CTS. But then at that point, then it is being left up to the individual components as to whether or not, do they want to continue with a single RI? Do they want to open it up to have multiple implementations? It will be up to each individual project to decide that.
I see. Okay. So it's too early to know then.
Yep.
Okay.
I know that there's a few projects. CDI is one that has two very solid implementations. JAX-RS has two very solid implementations. So I can see either of them, possibly opening up to say, hey, yep, we've got multiple implementations. So it's not a single reference anymore. But, that's still going to come out sometime down the road.
Right.
Well, the problem with the reference implementation is just if people kind of argue with, oh, we are the reference implementation, we are right.
Yep.
So you have two different ways, and it's not about which is the better way, but we are the reference implementation. That's the right way. That's just not good. And I have to give a big shout out to the JBoss guys, which are really keen to just do the best thing, not what Well is doing, but they look at the problems and sometimes they say, no, you're wrong. And sometimes they say, perfectly right, we should change this. And that's how it should be.
Yep.
Like in a lot of situations, it makes sense because we all know that writing one thing and testing it is two different things. Like testing maybe 10 times more code than writing a thing. So I think in these cases, just writers of the reference implementation relied on what they wrote, and they didn't have resources to cover all the use cases with tests. So if we didn't have the reference implementation, we would have to rely on the tests, which wouldn't be complete, or it takes a lot of resources and time to make them complete. So that's where I guess a reference implementation works. But I wouldn't want to really resort to this as reference implementation be the real the standard or the description of how the behavior. It should more be like an example of how to do things ideally, but in reality not all can be covered by tests. So
if the reference is not the TZK but the reference implementation, then you are stuck with not being able to evolve the reference implementation, because in the next spec version, you have to change the reference implementation code, and you might totally change the behavior, which then breaks a lot of user code. And that's why the TZK must be stable, must be the reference and not the RI.
I agree. In my point, the ideal world, we would have all behavior would be covered by tests, and the reference implementation, or just an example implementation, I would say, just prove that it's really possible to create an implementation. But as I said, reality is much worse. So, but I think in MicroProfile we agree that it's enough to have an example implementation, and every version can have a different example implementation. So I think it's enough. Yeah, but in reality, again, in MicroProfile, I found many situations not covered by the tests, and if I can't rely on the reference implementation, then there's no easy way how to say what's the preferred behavior.
But in MicroProfile, it's easy. Just discuss this behavior and add a test, because the source of the TCK is open as well.
Sure.
And so far, it's been working out pretty well.
Yeah, for MicroProfile, I don't know if it would be enough for E4J or Next Java E. Okay, I think we have 12 more minutes. Should we come back to the agenda and wrap up? Just I know that there are not many of us, so it's not easy to come to some conclusions, but maybe just review what's been going on. So I just copied some points from the previous agenda where we were talking about 1.4 maintenance 2.0. I saw some discussion on the mailing list and questions about whether we should have 1.4 or not, if we just create how-tos and guides. So I think either metrics or one of the specifications maybe will have a maintenance release, but I'm not sure if it's enough to justify 1.4 release.
Yeah. That's what I'm wondering too. And I know that some of them are doing the TCK updates with the third digit, but I haven't heard of anybody stepping up to a second digit release yet.
When is 1.4 supposed to come out?
Ask John.
So is it not posted on the Eclipse site?
I think on the Eclipse project it's something like 24th March or something like that.
Oh, okay, another month.
It should be end of March, but it can easily be April. Like we moved 1.3 to January, so it doesn't matter so much.
With moving features from the config.jsr to MicroProfile config, we got a few people on the config.jsr which are not yet involved in MicroProfile. For example, Sebastian Daschner and Thomas Langer from Oracle, but they're doing great work. So we have to kind of get them to also show up here so we can move over the code as well, and they get their royalty.
Basically, if you think, or you may try, if you want to copy the current work from config.jsr to MicroProfile config, maybe it will be enough to release it as a next version by the end of March.
Yeah.
It could possibly justify MicroProfile 1.4 release with some other specifications.
I think that's a great idea, Andro.
But before this meeting, we didn't know even, at least I didn't know that MicroProfile JSR is, config JSR is going on. I thought that it's complete.
Yeah, it's having great progress actually.
So
you know
that you brought it up.
The implicit converters is also kind of got moved from the config.jsr over. Emily moved this over, and we released MicroProfile config. I think 1.2 was this.
Right.
So,
yep,
it's happening.
Well, one thing related to the configuration specification is some common. There are some common things, common APIs that could be reused by other specifications. In particular, converters. Which
yeah, we had a long discussion with Andres Almiray, and this was kind of particular because it took me a few minutes or a quarter of an hour to understand what he wants, and then we sat back, and it doesn't make any sense. And the point is this: technically, a converter is just a function from A to B. So we have this already with the functional interface in Lambda in Java 8. So you actually don't need a specific converter API nowadays. The second thing is that config has only from string to a type. And even if you have the same functionality from string to type for the desktop API, which Andres needs, it's something totally different because it misses the context.
But you're talking about the interface.
Yeah, but give me a minute. The point is, if you have a configuration from string to, let's say, a date, then for config, you want this to be as stable as possible. It must not change if the language or the locale changes. For the UI part, so you in the config converter, you will kind of always use the ISO format, for example. In the UI world, you want it completely the different way. You want to always adopt to the locale and the language of the user sitting in front of your UI.
So I think I understand. You think that
doing something totally different.
Yeah. So you say that you would need to have two different converters most of the time. That I can agree. That's why I said it's not about only about the interface. It can be two different interfaces.
It's semantic.
Lots in common in the document which specify the implicit converters. So and basically the way how the converters or how the implicit converters work in MicroProfile config 1.2. These converters from constructors accepting strings and things like that, and all these things can be reused in other converters used by other specifications. I think last one was in Jewett. There were some need, or even they defined their own converters. So a lot of things were duplicated, and there's a risk that this wouldn't be synchronized. So it would work in different way in different specifications.
Yes, we've also discussed whether it makes sense to have an own converter specification, and I think Steve Colburn tries to get this done since quite a few years, but it's in the details. It's really complicated, and it's probably not worth it because you can't. A converter nowadays is a lambda.
Yeah, but I think it's worth to investigate if we can have a specification which wouldn't specify the interface. It would specify this logic, like the implicit converters, that the server, the implementation provides a converter for these types from string. It doesn't matter what the interface is used to specify custom converters, but the implicit converters should be there for every specification, and they should work in the same way across different APIs.
Yes. I mean, it would be definitely fun to put together a list of kind of use cases and things to take care of when working on a converter spec. Maybe we pull it off and create a converter spec. Not quite sure.
Maybe we could, first thing we could do is to create two different specification documents for configuration spec, just to separate these pieces which could be reusable in other specifications in a separate document, and release two documents together as one configuration spec.
Are we doing that already? I mean, we got the JSR spec and we have the MicroProfile.
I don't mean this. I mean that MicroProfile configuration would release two documents, not just one configuration spec, but configuration spec and all these common things in a different document.
No, if we would go that way, then we would really need a converter spec, a separate thing, which kind of is reusable.
That would be a next step, but as the first thing, I would just split the document in two and release them together as one spec, but just two different documents, like CDI did. Like they released basically three different documents.
Yes, not quite sure you want this, because I'm not a big fan of the SE-EE split, because of course the EE was baked in the SE, but CDI is 98% running in all environments, SE and EE, and the old specification added just a few exceptional wordings. Oh, in EE, if you have to deal with EGPs, then it's behaving a little bit different.
Well,
and now
I try to explain what I'm expecting.
And splitting, we blew up the spec from 90 pages to 200 pages. So I'm not quite sure if this is so much more readable for the users. You have to always use keep the users in mind.
I understand. The thing I'm expecting from this is to make it more evident that the configuration specification declares also something like this, like common behavior, because other specifications wouldn't see it. People who work on Jewett, they would just know that there is a configuration spec, and if they don't go into details of the API because they are working on something else, they wouldn't know. If they see that the configuration spec released 2 documents and one of them is about converters, then that.
Andre?
I think we lost Andre.
Yep.
We're almost out of time anyway.
He's frozen in time.
Oh, he's back.
I thought I dropped out after an hour, 60 minutes.
You have a clone now.
Yep. You got a frozen one.
So my idea was to make it more visible that the configuration spec also defines behavior for converters, which could be reused by the specs. And be visible by other people working on different specs. Yeah. That's my point. I don't want to overcomplicate things. Just to clarify what's going on.
A cool goal. I would be happy if people finally also, I mean, they're starting to use config, and I think so far the feedback was really good. And this is the first step, that other specs use config and make use of it.
Okay. Okay, maybe it's not necessary. Okay, it was just an idea. So I think we're approaching the end of the hour.
Yeah.
So just to wrap up, we didn't continue or didn't go through much of the agenda, but the important thing was said that Mark will look into what's new in config.jsr, and we'll try to merge some new things into config in MicroProfile and possibly release a new version. And then we would release 1.4. Otherwise, there's really little reason to release MicroProfile 1.4. Apart from that, not really much to say.
So the user guides will just come out on their own without any kind of, not under a specific release. Is that the idea?
Yeah. Like my idea with user guides is that it's a continual process, and we don't have to have a version like user guides 1.0 or user guides 1.1. It was just about allocating the time. So this is the quarter where we mostly allocated the time to writing documents, although we haven't written much. But I saw individual vendors invested a lot of time in really good resources. I saw really great resources with at Open Liberty Project. So maybe IBM could donate at least some of them as small short guides to this initiative. And yeah, that's it. Like in the next quarter, maybe we will decide that we want to devote the time to the new specs, and then they will come back to the guides, or some people will just decide they have time to write the guides and will continue. The idea was to basically start this initiative, start thinking about this, because until now we just thought about APIs and new features.
Okay, very good. You're muted, Kevin. We cannot hear you. There. No, we cannot hear you. No. Just type real fast.
I think the time's up anyway, so.
I think he just agreed with everything you said, Andre.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys,
for joining.
Bye.
See you.